for the afternoon session. Super excited to have Seana Coulson. Hope that was the right pronunciation. From UCSD. She works at the Cognitive Science Department, studies how humans learn how to reason with language. And she's particularly well known for her work on conceptual blending, as you can see. That's essentially how I understood it, is kind of how we transfer some problem solutions or ideas from one conceptual space to another one. And in particular, when I heard a talk on it, she was using the words source and target domain. And this is something that we use in distribution shifts and machine learning. So I thought maybe you can tell us the cognitive science understanding of how you use these words in the context of conceptual blending. So yeah, she has also recently started to understand how LLMs mimic human behavior. And so maybe she can tell us more about this stuff. So let's welcome her.
All right. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to talk today. And I want to start by thanking my collaborators. I hope you guys don't hold them culpable for any speculative claims that I'll no doubt make today. Okay, so the overarching issue that I'd like to talk about is how we understand the meaning of words. And language models like ChatGPT kind of motivated an approach to meaning known as distributional semantics, right? So this is the idea that words mean what they do because of the way that they're distributed in the language, right? So you might learn that helicopter and drone have kind of similar meanings because they occur in similar linguistic contexts. And it turns out that computational instantiations of this kind of an approach are incredibly powerful. They're very good at predicting human responses to language. And this has led some researchers to kind of argue that they're a plausible model for human language comprehension. But one problem for this kind of an account of word meaning is that this kind of an understanding isn't grounded in the world. So elaborating on the Chinese room experiment from Searle, Steve Harned kind of invites people to imagine what would it be like to learn Mandarin exclusively from a Mandarin dictionary, right? And so the idea is that you could learn a lot about how the symbols in Mandarin relate to one another, but it would be really hard from this kind of an approach to figure out how those symbols relate to things in the world, right? How do you know that the Mandarin character for cheeseburger actually relates to cheeseburgers? And so this is going to be a problem for a distributional approach to meaning, right? This is exactly the situation that they're in, is that they can infer that two characters have similar meanings because they occur in different contexts, but how do they know what it relates to in the real world? Okay, so I want to talk today about some work I've been doing with colleagues working in natural language processing. And this work was intended to kind of address the limits of distributional information in human understanding. And the crux of the idea is that if you take a language model that's trained only on language data, right, so no like RLHF or anything like that, it kind of gives you the best case scenario for a distributional approach to meaning. And so if you can identify human meaning phenomena that the language models struggle with, then you've kind of come up against the limits of distributional semantics. And so where we kind of started out looking for boundary conditions, it soon became apparent that these models are just super, super powerful. And so I'll tell you about my kind of adventures, because it's sort of given me an identity crisis, right? As I've struggled to reconcile my commitments to a cognitive usage-based approach to meaning with ungrounded distributional semantics. Okay, so this is a slide I've used in lots of talks over the years, and it's about my model of language comprehension, where language prompts the construction of cognitive models in working memory about the discourse topic. And while language input is absolutely crucial, its contribution isn't deterministic because there's lots of other kind of relevant information sources. So the listener's current cognitive and affective state, perceptual input, and things like the social context of the utterance. Okay, so the approach is inspired by work in cognitive semantics, right? So stuff by scholars like Ron Laneker, Gilles Fauconnier, George Lakoff, and it draws on these three important concepts of mental spaces, mappings, and conceptual integration or blending. Okay, so first off, mental spaces are partial cognitive models that you set up in working memory in response to the demands of meaning construction. And you use them to represent both real and imagined scenarios. And the different kinds of spaces include things like reality spaces, where we represent facts, but also hypothetical and counterfactual spaces to represent more hypothetical information. So we can use mental spaces to represent the contents of a wish, or a representation like a sketch or a photograph. You can have a mental space for the contents of a belief or a particular perspective. Okay, so mental spaces are used to partition incoming information so that we can represent the connection between, for instance, a person's actual face and then their reflection in the mirror. Right, so the second key idea here is mappings. This is correspondences between elements and relationships in different mental spaces. So for example, Peter Parker and Spider-Man are represented in different mental spaces because Peter Parker is a high school student and Spider-Man is a crime-fighting superhero, right? And so the mappings between them can be based on different kinds of relationships. So the idea is like Peter Parker and Spider-Man are the same guy, but they have different properties, right? And so mapping could be based on identity, like Peter Parker and Spider-Man, but also analogy, right? So they each have different occupations. Similarity, things that look alike could have mappings, or representation. Like an example of representation might be Tobey Maguire has a mapping between one portrayal of Spider-Man because he represents him in one of the movies. Okay, so finally we get to conceptual integration or blending, right? So this is a set of processes for information integration where you take partial structure from two or more mental spaces and dynamically combine them in kind of a simulation process. So this is an important aspect of metaphor, where you would have a mapping between a source and a target space, but many other sorts of semantic phenomena. Okay, so the mention of partitions kind of calls to mind this beautiful book by Salman Rushdie. It's about life in India around the time that the British, in their infinite wisdom, divided the country into Hindu and Muslim factions. Okay, and so from Midnight's Children, we can see this statement about time that kind of motivates a mental spaces analysis. So it, meaning time, could even be partitioned. The clocks in Pakistan would run half an hour ahead of their Indian counterparts. Okay, so this sets up a need for two different mental spaces, one for India and one for, at this point, the future space of Pakistan, and clocks in each one that are connected by a mapping, right? So the clocks in Pakistan have slightly different properties from the clocks in India, right? So this clock in India is at 3 o'clock and this one's at 3:30. So the clocks are linked by analogy, and then the different times on them is a disanalogy kind of mapping. Okay, and then we get to conceptual blending, which you can see in this quote here, also from Midnight's Children. So Mr. Kamal, who wanted nothing to do with partition, was fond of saying, "Here's proof of the folly of the scheme. Those leaguers plan to abscond with a whole 30 minutes. Time without partitions," Mr. Kamal cried. Okay, so the thing that you need the conceptual blending for is to get this construal of the leaguers as stealing time. Okay, so the possibility of construing the leaguers as stealing 30 minutes relies on a blend of these two mental spaces. We have Pakistan before partition and then Pakistan afterwards. So before partition, it's part of India, and afterwards it's a sovereign nation. Before partition, it's in the same time zone as India, and then afterward, it's an independent time zone. And then we know that the Leaguers have kind of a causal role in bringing about the sovereign nation. And that's what enables this conceptual blend where you get the idea of stealing time, right? Where you can take this disanalogy between the two clocks and construe it as a change that's caused by the shift from being part of India to an independent nation, right? So in the blend, the Leaguers are motivated by greed and they steal time. And you're construing time as this like quantified object. Whereas in the input space, the Leaguers are just motivated by a desire for an independent nation.
Working memory only, or what? Because you also include belief, right? This thing, like, it's a long-term memory.
Oh, the idea is initially it's going to be set up in working memory, but it could be stored and then appealed to at a later date. Yeah, so it's not as though it's never in long-term memory. It's just that it always kind of starts out there.
Now that space where they come together, is there going to be one space or both at the same time? Or you could have one view where, as you put this up, I'm having a Pakistani view and an Indian view, and in the other clock is either forward or backward, depending on which side I look at, or is it that we choose one of those?
Well, it depends. It depends on the particular meaning construction operation, right? But like in the literary example, it seems as though you can have like this disjointed view, but then in the blended construal, it's sort of like all of a sudden these 30 minutes have been taken away. But yeah, there's cases where you could shift back and forth. There's cases where you might want to have them overlap. There's cases where you sort of run it where the time slips away. Yeah, so the basic idea is that understanding language involves constructing and integrating cognitive models in mental spaces, and then establishing mapping between information that's active in each space. Okay, so these meaning construction operations rely on the coordination of information from a variety of sources, including language, perception, social context, and so forth. Okay, so the idea is you hear an utterance like, when I ask the bartender for something cold and full of rum, you take advantage of the information in the various boxes, such as language, social context, perceptual input, and so forth. And that prompts the activation of declarative knowledge structures. Okay, so things like frames, scripts, and schemas from long-term memory. And these data structures could account for the unstated information that people take for granted when they communicate. Okay, so part of the reason the punchline in a joke is surprising is you've activated this unstated information. So the bartender usually recommends drinks, right? And part of the reason the joke is funny is that you're able to incorporate the meaning of the punchline here, wife, via a process that I call frame shifting. So this is a reanalysis process where you reorganize the existing elements in the representation into a new frame, and you get new inferences from it. So the original request for a drink recommendation gets reconstrued as an insult to the bartender's wife. Apologies, these jokes are pretty offensive. They all kind of play on these, old cultural models. Okay, so for one thing, frame shifting that happens in jokes highlights the importance of background knowledge for meaning. If you hadn't made some assumptions about what's going on based on the kinds of interactions people have with bartenders, then you wouldn't be surprised at the punchline. But the interesting thing is that the surprise isn't just that a word doesn't mean what you thought. For example, the word cold means something different before you get the joke than afterwards. But the whole scenario differs from what you had assumed. Oops. Right. And most of all, frame shifting kind of reveals how flexible language users are. Right. The way that you're able to integrate some aspects of your initial erroneous interpretation with the new information that you get in the punchline. Okay, so as I see it, the key issue is whether pragmatics, that is the situational and background knowledge, comes in at the final stage of the comprehension process, or whether it has like a more expansive role and encompasses the whole interactive process. So classical approaches to meaning suggest that ambiguity is the main problem we need to solve. But constructivist approaches suggest the real problem is semantic indeterminacy. Okay, so one example might be, what does it mean for pork chops to be ready?
Sorry, can you go back one slide?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the difference.
The difference? So
ambiguity and semantic indeterminacy sounds like ambiguity to me.
okay. So the distinction that I'm making is ambiguity is you have a finite set of fixed interpretations and you have to choose between them. Whereas semantically indeterminate means it's sort of vague. So there's a whole space of potential interpretations.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Right. So we could take the case of what it means for pork chops to be ready. So on the classical view, context would help you decide which of your dictionary definitions is appropriate. So the main challenge is ambiguity. But I think the real challenge is indeterminacy, right? So the meaning of ready is going to be very different for a cook than it is for a butcher. And typically understanding the meaning of ready and all that it kind of implies about the current situation is less a matter of your linguistic knowledge and more related to background knowledge. Okay, so take what it means for pork chops to be ready here, right? A thoughtful wife has pork chops ready when her husband comes home from fishing. So here you have to shift from an interpretation that relies on the 1950s housewife frame to a snarky wife who anticipates her husband's failure in the fishing department. So to get this joke, you kind of need to have a fishing script where the last scene is you take the fish that you caught that day and you cook it and you eat it for dinner. So this is why the wife's cooking endeavors can be construed as an insult to the husband because she's anticipating he won't catch any fish. Okay, so earlier in my career, I became attracted to the idea of jokes because the meaning change due to frame shifting seems as though it can't really be explained by compositional mechanisms of reanalysis. So jokes sometimes do turn on syntactic ambiguities, but usually that's not enough to get you the whole new interpretation. And while alternative word meanings play a big role in certain kinds of humor, right, in the case of the bartender joke, cold and full of rum means something pretty different after the punchline than before. It doesn't fully account for the fact that we now understand the bartender's remark as an insult to his wife, and we might even have an opinion about the state of his marriage. Okay, so in fact, like the whole like full of rum and the fact that you can get kind of a novel meaning shows you that people are able to create completely new meanings in these kinds of joke spaces. Okay, so I've suggested that any account of language comprehension should be flexible enough to deal with the frame shifting that happens in jokes, because they demonstrate, human flexibility of meaning. So we can consider jokes as kind of a stress test for human language processing models. Okay, so this raises the question of whether frame shifting is a thing, right? Because the psychological reality of frame shifting would suggest language users are sensitive not just to word level expectancies, but to expectancies driven by contextually evoked frames. Right, so in an early study on this topic, we asked whether frame shifting involved in joke comprehension imposes processing costs that could be registered in real-time measures of brain activity. Okay, so the way we measure brain activity is to record participants' EEG. And so we have people wear electrode caps like a swim cap with electrodes in it, and these go on the outer surface of the scalp. Okay, each electrode records changes in the electrical potential that occurs over time. And of course, given that the electrodes are on the outer surface of the skull, they're only recording a small subset of the brain activity. And the reason the technique works at all is because neurons communicate with electrochemical signals. So on the left, we have a schematic diagram of a neuron. Particularly relevant for EEG are the dendrites, the little branch-like structures. And most neural communication involves synaptic connections where one cell releases neurotransmitters in the proximity of the dendrites of other cells. So when the neurotransmitters bind to the dendrites, it allows the ions to move in and out of the cell, changing the electrical potential. So once the cell reaches a critical threshold, it will spike, and this will send a pulse down the axon and release neurotransmitters that can then synapse onto other cells. Okay, so basically the cell's aggregating inputs at its dendrites from the many cells it's connected to, and then this influences whether it's going to fire its own action potential and impact cells downstream from it. So EEG is reflecting these postsynaptic potentials from the cortical pyramidal cells. And if you look at the ongoing EEG response from an individual electrode, all you kind of see is a oscillatory signal. But if you do a little bit of signal processing to relate the EEG to the kinds of stimuli that the person is responding to, it's possible to pull out a predictable series of positive and negative peaks in what's called the ERP for event-related potential. So the ERP is a record of how the voltage plotted on the y-axis changes as a function of time relative to the onset of some kind of stimulus, like in my case, a word. And so the positive and negative peaks in the ERP are called components. And language ERP researchers tend to plot negative voltage upwards because one of the first ERP components known to be sensitive to language was a negative going ERP component. So this is a negative peak that happens about 400 milliseconds after the onset of a word. Right, and so lots of research has shown that the presentation of words in the written, the spoken, or the sign modality is associated with this negative going response in the brainwaves that starts about 200 milliseconds after the word starts, and it peaks about 400 milliseconds. And the reason that it's exciting is because it's sensitive to how well the meaning of the word that's eliciting it fits into the context. So here, in the context of a list of reptiles, eyeballs elicits a big N400. But if you have a word that actually fits the context, like lizards or snakes, then it'll elicit a smaller N400. So the canonical way to get an N400 is to present people with a sentence context that either ends predictably or with a semantic anomaly. And then you time lock the ERP to the onset of the final word in the sentence. So the N400 tends to be much larger, that is more negative for the anomalous endings like dog than for the predictable ones like sugar. Yes, 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 exactly, right? So yeah, what I'm trying to get at here is that the N400 is sensitive to semantic factors. And the way that this was initially discovered was to just take anomalous things. But then it turns out that it's sensitive to the predictability of words in a very fine-grained kind of way. Okay, so N400 is kind of exciting because you see N400 effects regardless of whether the stimuli is a written word, a spoken word, or a sign word, suggesting that it's really getting at the meaning. and not something about the physical aspect of the stimulus. You don't need sentence context to see N400 effects, right? The second word of an unrelated word pair elicits a larger N400 than a related word pair. And by default, the N400 is large and it's reduced by facilitative context, right? So congruent context leads to less negative N400. And historically, this has been interpreted as happening because the context pre-activates semantic features associated with the word. So with no context, retrieval demands are normal and you get a large N400. But if you have some facilitative context, some of those semantic features are already active, so the N400 shrinks. And even though we think of N400 as being a language elicited ERP component, it's important to understand that it's also elicited by non-linguistic stimuli like drawings and photographs and emoji and gestures and movies, right? So in all these cases, the less sensible case, like cutting bread with an iron, gives you a big N400, and the more predictable case, like cutting bread with a knife, gives you a small N400. Okay, and interestingly, the factor that's most tied to N400 amplitude is close probability. So this is a measure of the predictability of a word given the sentence context. Right, so you give people a sentence and then you have them fill in the last word, right? And so the close probability is what percentage of people produce that word. Okay. So if you look at the sentence medial panel, you can see N400 is large for low close items. It's smaller for moderate close items in red, and then smallest for the very predictable high close items. Right, and then the sentence final pane, the anomalous endings in yellow give you the biggest N400, and the black high close endings elicit the smallest N400, and there's a gradient in between. Okay, and actually there's a linear relationship between close probability and N400, and the two values are highly correlated.
Ask to get this probability value?
Typically people ask about 25 to 30. Yeah.
Particular sentence, you don't have to say that.
Yeah. And so, if you have something that's very unpredictable, you could get a close probability of 0 if you only ask 30 people. But if you ask 30,000, you might get, one person coming out with that. So there's sort of empirical limitations to it.
What you ask are similar to the ones where you measure the N400?
Yeah, typically it's the same subject pool. Yeah. Okay, so right, so going back to joke comprehension, we asked whether the frame shifting involved in joke comprehension imposes processing costs that go beyond that associated with reading an unexpected word. Right, and so we found some jokes and we normed them by giving sentence frames to a bunch of undergraduates in a closed task. And noticing that some of the sentence frames seem to really lead people to have a definite expectation about the sentence final word. Like this, I asked the woman at the party if she remembered me from last year, and she said she never forgets. A lot of people sort of say the same thing. But then there's other sentences, like my husband took the money we were saving to buy a new car, blew it all at the... There's a lot of ways to blow money, so you get a real diverse set of different responses. But in each case, we either ended the sentence with the joke ending or with an equally unexpected straight ending that was sort of consistent with the contextually evoked frame. Right, and so the idea was that since we've matched for close probability, if we see differences between the joke ending and the straight ending, it suggests that the demands of understanding the joke sort of require you to take into account these higher level contextual factors, besides the fact that you're getting something sort of unexpected. Okay, so it turns out that at least for the high constraint sentence frames where people have a definite expectation for what should be coming, jokes elicit a larger N400 than the non-funny control sentences. So this fit with our hypothesis. But it was also the case that not everybody got the jokes. And while the brain response differed as a function of whether people got the jokes or not, we could see N400 effects both in the good joke comprehenders and in the poor joke comprehenders. So it's kind of unlikely that the N400 actually reflects anything to do with frame shifting, since people who aren't doing the frame shifting are still showing the same effect.
What is conceptually doing the N400 for us? Is that, how does that tie back to the theories that we're maintaining about things?
Well, the idea is the N400 is some index of human meaning construction, since it's being pushed around by whether something makes sense or not. And so, you know, if you're positing something, you want at least control for the things that are known to be varied.
Why is it necessarily meaning construction and not simply tracking mistakes?
It could, I mean, given what I've told you, it could be tracking mistakes. But it's like if you just present something in a big font, so you have the word that people are expecting, but it's in like a strange format, you don't get an N400, you get what's called a P300. So it's definitely sensitive to unexpected things at the level of meaning, as opposed to the modality or.
And has there been a careful correlation between the closed probabilities, the N400 scores, and next token probability values in a modern language model?
Well, this is the thing. Actually, I'll fast forward. Yeah, this is the thing. Like, for a long time, people have thought like, oh, well, maybe N400 is sensitive to information processing, and they used n-gram models to get estimates, and they could never do as well as closed probability. But I think the problem was that n-gram models just aren't a great approximation of what is actually the next most expected thing. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so besides the N400, there's also other effects in the ERP, these late positivities, something called a P600, and you do see P600s for these jokes, and a frontocentral positivity, right, depending on whether it's a high constraint or a low constraint. So these are more likely to be related to the semantics of joke comprehension. But then the effect we thought was most likely to be related to actually frame shifting was this thing that I've circled here, because we see it both for high constraint jokes and for low constraint jokes, but only in people who actually get the jokes, right? So the upshot is that the processing demands of jokes aren't simply due to expectancy violations, because we see the N400 component for the high constraint jokes, and we see late developing positivities in the ERP for all the jokes. Whoops. Right, so basically we did our best to kind of control for how expected the words were, but we find that the things that weren't backed up by the contextual expectations, the jokes, do seem to impose additional processing demands. Okay, but I think this,
person was from understanding the context. Like you said earlier in the fisherman example, that if I have knowledge about the fisher, I can get the joke and maybe would come to that conclusion faster. But if I don't, or tangentially, then obviously I have to work harder to get the joke, or maybe not even notice that it is a joke, like I did not notice. Do you have any information about your subjects in that way?
We are just relying on the fact that they're in our subject pool, so they're going to a major, American university. Since we did this study. We've done things like looking at people where English is their second language, right? So they're from a foreign country. And we find that the thing that's most predictive of their ability to get like dumb jokes like this is sort of how integrated they are into kind of mainstream American culture. And, you know, basically the more familiar people are with the background knowledge, the more readily they get the jokes. So, yeah. And presumably, I think some of the reason some of our people didn't get the jokes was they just didn't expect jokes in the context of a cognitive science experiment. And so they weren't really looking for jokes. So in the first study, there was just a ton of filler materials. So there were very few jokes. And it's not that great of an environment for jokes either, because you're reading sentences one word at a time in a dark chamber by yourself. So, you know, I'm sure some of these people would have great senses of humor, and plus our jokes really aren't that funny.
So, but why jokes? Like frame shift, everything requires, any kind of like logical thinking requires me to do frame shifts of sorts.
It's true, there's frame shifting in all kinds of non-humorous contexts. It's just the nice thing about jokes is you can get a whole bunch of stimuli that are relatively short, and it's concentrated in these cases in a single word, which we need to time lock to the brain activity.
But it could be that we are finding a signature of jokes, not of frame shifting.
It's true, it's true. Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, I like the director M. Night Shyamalan for lots of frame shift. Like at the end of some of those movies, there's just a dramatic reinterpretation of everything that came before. The end of The Sixth Sense, for example. But yeah, if I could get, I mean, jokes were an easy place to get a whole bunch of stimuli of the right kind. But yeah, it would certainly be nice to have like a whole bunch of mathematical frame shifts, for example, could be really cool. Yeah.
And all of the jokes were of this very sudden last
Right.
probability term. The concern that came into my mind was your measurements might be attenuated by someone anticipating punchline, but if it's really just out of left field, then that doesn't seem like a problem. So I just asked to confirm that my suspicion was correct there.
Right. Yeah, and that's partially because of the limitations of EEG, right? You want something where the thing that you're interested in can be time locked too.
Right.
So.
Well, yeah, that's why I was concerned about being able to anticipate a punchline, because that's just going to spread the signal out more.
Right, yeah. Okay, so one issue with frame shifting and this whole idea is the frame representation is a little bit brittle. I mean, I think these data suggest that, you know, people are sensitive to causal and relational information, the kinds of things that motivate the idea of frame type data structures, hierarchical attribute value, and default slot filling. So just basically the fact that people are sort of sensitive to conceptual structure in the world. But in terms of a declarative data structure, they're a little bit clunky, right? Because they're very rigid. And if you actually try to do an NLP task with these kinds of data structures, it's quite difficult. Like you have to always be augmenting the system. So in other work, I've suggested frame shifting might involve recruiting sensory motor cortex in embodied simulation that might help give you some flexibility. But more recently, I've kind of been exploring an approach articulated initially by Jeff Ellman, looking at recurrent neural networks, right? And so in a 2004 article, Ellman suggests the language user understanding a word is kind of like a paleontologist who uses the bones in order to kind of piece together the understanding of the whole life of the dinosaur. right? And so this is kind of in line with this idea that language is just one piece of the puzzle and it has to be combined with other kinds of information to get you the utterance meaning. Right, so the key insight isn't that that words don't contain meanings, that people have to construct them. And Elman's account gets power because it's actually grounded in a computational model, connectionist network trained to take activation patterns in, construed as words, and then predict the next word in the sequence. Right, and so in the diagram, we can see here how different usages of runs occupy different regions of the space depending on who's doing the running. So at the top, we have child, athlete, and jaguar running, clustering together. Those are like concrete uses, whereas more abstract cases of boss runs and clock runs cluster together more near the bottom. Right, and so here, we're seeing meaning as kind of movement through this state space set up by the model. Okay. Right, and so we can kind of think of Elman's recurrent networks as a primordial form of today's large language models. So neural language models take linguistic context in and then spit out the distribution of conditional probabilities for all the words in the vocabulary. Right, and so the large language models that we're actually looking at are ungrounded, right? So they have no perceptual experience of the world. They do have some capacities that might allow them to model joke comprehension, right? So most importantly, they provide an account of how word meaning can vary naturally as a function of context. And there's some work that suggests that the next word prediction task that they do can yield emergent sensitivity to background knowledge. And so the question is, does it actually give you the background knowledge you need to get jokes? Right, so one interesting thing is that the way to optimize a language model's predictions for conditional probability of a word is to adjust by the negative logarithm of the probability estimated for that word, right? So the surprisal for each word. Right, and so in a really nice paper published in 2015, Stefan Frank and colleagues recorded EEG while people read texts, and then they looked at whether there was a relationship between the size of a number of different ERP components and the surprisal as estimated by language models. And what they found was that there is, quote, a strong relation between the surprisal of a word and the amplitude of the N400 component in response to reading that word. Right, but this whole approach was questioned by neurolinguists who point out that if you look at human reading behavior, human measures of predictability typically outperform predictability measures from corpora. So we decided to look at this issue ourselves, asking whether N400 amplitude is more sensitive to closed probability from humans or surprisal derived from language models. So is the relationship between N400 and the conditional probability of words linear, as if you're making a prediction about one word, or whether it's logarithmic, if you are making a prediction across your whole vocabulary, the same way that language models do. So we used stimuli from a well-known study by DeLong and colleagues where they looked at the relationship between predictability and N400. Right, so they systematically vary the predictability of two words in a sentence, like the day was breezy, so the boy went outside to fly. And rather than using the original data, we took advantage of a large-scale replication study so that we could have more data, basically. And so we ran the stimuli through a number of different language models to get measures of predictability for all the target nouns in the study. And then we want to model single trial N400 amplitude using linear mixed effect regression models. So the outcome variable is going to be the N400 amplitude, and then the predictor is the predictability of each given word based on the different language models. So for the human measures, we took advantage of the closed probabilities collected by the investigators, and we also took the log to get the surprisals. And then for corpus-based surprisal scores, we used 2 different recurrent neural networks. We used some autoregressive transformers, including GPT-3, and then 3 masked transformers, including BERT. Right, and so what we're doing is nested model comparison, where we first fit a regression model using closed probabilities, and then we add in surprisal scores to see if it accounts for more variance. So we're asking whether language model surprisal can improve human measures. And you can see the answer is yes. So GPT-3, BERT, Roberta, and Albert all explain N400 variance above and beyond explained by closed scores. Right, so GPT-3 actually does a better job of predicting N400 amplitude than human closed data, suggesting the relationship between N400 and the predictability of a word is logarithmic. Okay, so I think one thing that this means is that the N400 component indexes an aspect of predictive coding and language processing. So since the turn of the 21st century, neuroscientists have kind of increasingly thought about brain activity in the framework of predictive coding, right? Where rather than thinking about brain activity as fundamentally kind of bottom up with occasional like top-down interventions, 5 minutes, okay. The basic idea is that the brain is running a generative model of the world. And so activity in lower levels involves predictions about future sensory input, and activity in higher levels is the consequences. So feed-forward activity isn't a picture of the world, it's just the difference between predicted activity and observed activity, something known as prediction error. Right, so the basic idea here is, N400 isn't the activation of semantic features in response to a word where close probability effects and surprisal effects result because of neural activity needed when top-down areas have pre-activated features, but it's just more a measure of prediction error. All right. Right, and so this makes sense if surprisal is the loss function that you want to use to tune up a generative model of language. Okay, so going back to my idea that jokes should serve as a stress test for human language processing models, the question is, well, what about the real-time brain response to jokes? Are statistics from language models predictive of joke effects in the ERPs? So to get at this question, we've started to reanalyze data from an old joke study. So the jokes are kind of old, but really what I mean is the data is old. We originally published a study in 2004. And at that time, we worked really hard to control the closed probability of the 2 different kinds of endings. But it turns out that there are actually differences if you use slight differences if you use modern metrics. Okay, so in this study, we have 160 different jokes. So each participant sees 80 jokes, 80 straight endings, and then 80 sentences that are just kind of normal psycholinguistic sentences that end with an expected word. Okay, and so just for fun, we started by throwing single trial data for all the conditions into a series of regressions where we try to predict the voltage of the EEG from the surprisal of the associated word at every single time step at every electrode. And then we correct for multiple comparisons using false discovery rate. And sure enough, if you do this, you get a response that looks remarkably like the N400 followed by a frontal positivity in the ERP. And if you do the same thing for contextual dissimilarity, so you measure the semantic distance between the last word of the sentence and the previous sentence context, you get kind of a similar looking response. Of course, each of these regressions was done independent of the other. And if we tried to analyze the same data with 2 predictors, we probably wouldn't have enough power to predict either one. So to get around that and try and look at whether surprisal or contextual dissimilarity provide a better account of the ERP data, we measured the N400 and the P600 in kind of the conventional way. So we averaged data from electrodes and time windows indicated in the literature, and then we did some model comparison. Right, so we compare how well mixed effects models with predictors like surprisal, estimated by GPT-3, and contextual dissimilarity, estimated by GLOVE, and then the experimental condition, treating the expected condition as kind of the reference. And our analysis suggests surprisal provides a pretty good account of the differences between in N400 amplitude between expected and the straight endings, but not the size of the jokes. And unlike surprisal, contextual dissimilarity remains significant even after you control for other effects. And after you control for other effects, the only condition effect still evident is the N400 elicited by jokes. Right, so in line with our original claims, the processing demands imposed by jokes seem to go above and beyond those posed by unexpected words in the straight condition. Right? Well, the expected are completely different sentence frames. So the straight endings are the same setup as the jokes, but just an unexpected word that's kind of fits with the kind of normal interpretation of the sentence. So it's not a word you're expecting, but it doesn't require you to reanalyze anything that came before. Yeah. Yeah. So the expected is just kind of like you're getting a word that's very predictable. Right. Yeah. So yeah, for the P600, we found pretty similar stuff that contextual dissimilarity kind of accounts pretty well for the size of the P600, but it doesn't completely account for the joke effect. Okay. So we asked whether joke effects are attributable to surprisal, and what we found is that while N400 is generally related to surprisal, the surprisal of the critical word in a joke didn't fully account for the size of the N400. And surprisal is less related to the P600, another language ERP component. And contextual dissimilarity scores were related to the size of both the N400 and P600 elicited by these materials. But crucially, the joke effects weren't fully explained by either surprisal or contextual dissimilarity. Okay, I should probably, oh, right. So it's probably the case that both contextual dissimilarity and surprisal are relevant for comprehension, but not all the exact same networks of brain regions. But neither one really seems to account for the ERPs elicited by jokes. So I'm just gonna skip this last little study. Go back to my identity crisis, right? So, right, so some of our work suggests that while large language models trained only on linguistic data can simulate many aspects of joke comprehension, feel free to ask me about any questions, GPT-3 was much worse than people in joke detection. It misses a lot of jokes and it exhibits poor performance on comprehension questions. And regarding whether large language models understand jokes, the data suggests the dynamics of the models capture something about jokes, but it's clear there's non-trivial differences between what people and the models do. Right, and relatedly, surprisal values for words in the EEG studies are more closely related to the neural response to the non-joke materials than for the jokes. So I think there's still support for this idea that language interpretation relies on background knowledge that goes beyond that that's available in the statistics of language. So I think we can learn a lot about language from GPT-3, but we shouldn't treat it as like a model of neural events underlying language. For one thing, we've seen it misses a lot of the key inferences in jokes. I do think that at a computational level, at least part of what the brain is doing is predicting the next word, running a generative model that's estimating the conditional probability of upcoming words, and that it's constantly adjusting the model in an optimal fashion by the surprisal of that word, the observed word. So our data fit the suggestion that while N400 might seem like a direct index of the activation of semantic features, in that it's sensitive to plausibility and predictability and things like that, it might actually just reflect the prediction error in processing and optimizing predictions. Okay, so I'm starting to think that some of the insights from predictive coding could be incorporated into my cognitive linguistic approach, right? Because large language models are the ultimate usage-based system. And the meanings that emerge in large language models do a really good job of modeling how word meanings vary as a function of contextual factors. And even if frames are a bit clunky to really model the flexibility that people show in semantic phenomena like frame shifting, it seems at least plausible that the flexible recruitment of background knowledge is captured by trajectories through state space. So the success of large language models at NLP tasks indicates both how rich the signal is in language utterances, and also tells us about the power of self-supervised learning based on predicting upcoming language tokens. Right, so maybe we could solve some of the problems with language models by just kind of grounding them. Right, so what if language models were trained not just from textual input, but from situated language utterances the way that human learners are, right? And so maybe the boxes and arrows here are dated, but I think there's still a need for relevant non-language input from perception and social context and so forth, right? And so the hope is that predictive learning mechanisms building a generative model not only from language input, but also like embodied and situated world knowledge could yield you an account of language comprehension that could handle the flexible and nuanced interpretive process that allows symbols to give rise to experiences like the ones these guys are having. All right, well, thanks for your attention.
Good question, otherwise.
Okay. And can you go back to the last slide?
This one?
So if you just learn from text, you already have the word situated in knowledge, right? Because it's not learning from dictionaries, it's learning from text. Do you really think there's so much added context in images?
In images?
Yeah.
It depends on the interaction. Yeah, you know, I'm not saying just visual input, but probably more sort of social interaction sorts of things. And you really see a big change if you look at language models that get just a little bit of you know, human input in the reinforcement signal.
Then that's thanks, Seana, again. And yeah, the current lecture starts at 3:30, so we'll have refreshments for 15 minutes.
So I'm curious, the frame shift.